When World War I erupted in 1914, it was seen by many as the conflict that would settle the question of global supremacy once and for all. The hope, at least in the early days, was that this war would be so decisive, so overwhelmingly destructive, that it would create a lasting peace. There was an idealistic belief that the horrors of war, when faced on such a massive scale, would bring the world to its senses. Political leaders, intellectuals and citizens alike believed that the sheer scale of the carnage would force nations to reconsider the way they engaged with one another. This belief that World War I would be the war to end all wars was rooted in several key ideas. First, the scale of the conflict was unprecedented. The war involved not just the major European powers, but also their colonies, stretching the battlefield across continents. The introduction of modern weaponry, machine guns, tanks, chemical gas and aerial bombardment made it clear that the world had entered a new era of warfare. The war wasn't just a series of battles. It was a total war, one that consumed the entire economy and society of the nations involved. In the face of such destruction, it seemed logical that this conflict would lead to a reckoning. People believed that after the war, the sheer magnitude of loss and devastation would force leaders to rethink how they engaged in conflict. The idea was that no nation would want to go through something like this again. This idealism was reflected in the goals of the peace treaties that followed the war. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was supposed to lay the groundwork for lasting peace. The architects of the treaty, most notably US President Woodrow Wilson, envisioned a new world order built on principles of collective security and diplomacy. Wilson's famous 14 points included calls for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and the creation of the League of Nations, a body designed to prevent future wars. Wilson's vision for the League of Nations was especially important. He believed that through open dialogue and collective action, the great powers of the world could avoid the mistakes of the past. The hope was that the League would serve as a forum for nations to resolve disputes peacefully and prevent any one nation from becoming too dominant. The idea was revolutionary. No longer would nations rely on military might to settle their differences. The League would be the embodiment of the hope that World War I had been so horrific that humanity would never again allow such a catastrophe to happen. However, despite these lofty ideals, the post-war world was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. While the ideals behind the Treaty of Versailles seemed promising on paper, the reality was far more complicated. The treaty was meant to bring about lasting peace, but in practice, it sowed the seeds of future conflict by creating a series of political, economic and territorial problems that would ultimately fuel the rise of extremist movements and another world war. The treaty, signed in 1919, was the result of months of negotiations between the Allied powers, France, Britain, and Italy, along with the newly formed United States. The central figures in shaping the treaty were British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and US President Woodrow Wilson. While Wilson pushed for a fair peace based on his 14 points, Clemenceau and Lloyd George had their own agendas. They were primarily focused on punishing Germany for its role in the war and ensuring that the country would never again pose a threat to Europe. The harsh conditions imposed on Germany were a direct result of these punitive intentions. The treaty required Germany to accept full responsibility for the war, a clause known as the War Guilt Clause. This not only humiliated the German people, but also placed the entire burden of the war's costs on their shoulders. Germany was forced to pay enormous reparations, an amount that over time became financially crippling. These reparations led to rampant inflation and economic instability in Germany, creating widespread resentment among the population. The treaty also resulted in the loss of significant territories for Germany. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France, and Germany was stripped of its overseas colonies. The Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations control, and the city of Danzig became a free city. Additionally, the Rhineland was demilitarized, which limited Germany's ability to defend itself. The dismemberment of the German Empire and the punitive economic measures created a sense of injustice among many Germans, who felt they had been unfairly treated. This sense of humiliation and resentment would later become a key element in the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler exploited the anger surrounding the Treaty of Versailles, using it to rally support and position himself as the voice of a wounded, betrayed Germany. He promised to undo the terms of the treaty and restore Germany to its former glory. In doing so, he was able to gain the support of millions of Germans who believed that the treaty had been unjust, and that their country deserved revenge. Moreover, the Treaty of Versailles failed to address the underlying causes of World War I, such as militarism, nationalism, and the complex system of alliances that had drawn Europe into war in the first place. Instead, the treaty focused primarily on punishing Germany, while leaving the structural problems in Europe largely untouched. The war did not solve the political and nationalistic tensions that had led to the conflict, it merely shifted them. Another key flaw in the Treaty of Versailles was the exclusion of key nations from the peace process. The Soviet Union, which had experienced its own revolution and withdrawal from the war in 1917, was not invited to the negotiations. Additionally, Germany was excluded from any meaningful role in shaping the post-war order. This created a sense of alienation and distrust among these nations, further destabilizing the international system. The United States, despite President Wilson's vision for a new world order, did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The U.S. Senate rejected the treaty, and by extension the League of Nations. This was a blow to Wilson's hopes for collective security, and it left the League of Nations without the support of one of the world's most powerful nations. The absence of the United States weakened the League and its ability to prevent future conflicts, as it lacked the necessary military and economic power to enforce its resolutions. The failure of the Treaty of Versailles to create a just and lasting peace was a critical moment in history. Rather than ending the cycle of war, it helped perpetuate it by fostering resentment and instability. The treaty's harsh terms set the stage for a second global conflict, as nations sought to redress the wrongs of the past, and powerful political movements like fascism and communism began to rise in response to the economic and social turmoil caused by the war and its aftermath. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the hope for lasting peace that followed World War I began to fade. The Treaty of Versailles and the establishment of the League of Nations were meant to create a new peaceful world order. However, instead of quelling the forces that had led to the war, they inadvertently empowered them, setting the stage for another catastrophic conflict. One of the key factors contributing to the failure of peace was the rise of nationalism. The Treaty of Versailles had redrawn the map of Europe, creating new borders and new nations, but these changes often ignored the complexities of ethnic and national identities. Ethnic minorities within newly established states, such as the Czechoslovakians in Hungary and the Germans in the Sudetenland, found themselves disenfranchised and dissatisfied. These groups began to push for autonomy or union with other nations, often stoking nationalistic sentiment and fueling instability. In Germany, this growing nationalism was harnessed by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler's promise to restore Germany's greatness and reverse the humiliation imposed by the Treaty of Versailles resonated deeply with a population struggling with economic hardship and social unrest. Hitler tapped into the anger of those who felt betrayed by the international community, using the language of nationalism and pride to rally support. He portrayed the Nazis as the true defenders of Germany's dignity, and their platform was built on the idea that the nation had been wronged by foreign powers. Meanwhile, Italy, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, also saw the rise of fascism. Mussolini's regime glorified nationalism and militarism, promoting the idea of Italian superiority and expansionism. Italy's desire to restore its former glory and build a new empire mirrored Germany's ambitions, and it led to an aggressive foreign policy that sought to challenge the post-war order. In Japan, militarism was also on the rise. The nation had emerged from World War I as a rising imperial power, and it sought to expand its influence in Asia. Japan's militaristic government pursued aggressive actions, such as the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, in defiance of international agreements. Like Hitler and Mussolini, Japanese leaders believed that the post-war world order was an obstacle to their national ambitions, and they sought to carve out a place of dominance for Japan on the global stage. These nationalistic and militaristic movements were not contained to Germany, Italy, and Japan. Across Europe, people were turning to extreme ideologies and movements as they sought answers to the problems left in the wake of World War I. Economic hardship, social instability, and a growing sense of betrayal provided fertile ground for the rise of authoritarian regimes that promised stability and national pride. At the same time, the League of Nations, the international body designed to prevent further conflicts, was quickly losing its effectiveness. The League was a noble idea, but it was crippled by several key factors. First, the United States, despite President Wilson's advocacy for its creation, never joined the League. This absence greatly weakened its ability to enforce peace, as the US was one of the most powerful nations in the world, and its participation could have given the League the authority it needed to deter aggression. Second, the League lacked a standing military force. While it could issue condemnations and economic sanctions against aggressor nations, it had no way to physically enforce its decisions. As a result, when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League was unable to stop the aggression, and the sanctions it imposed were largely ineffective. Similarly, when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League could only issue protests, which had little impact on Japan's actions. In Europe, many nations were unwilling to take a stand against rising aggression. The memories of World War I were still fresh, and the idea of another war seemed unthinkable. This led to a policy of appeasement, particularly by Britain and France, who hoped that by conceding to some of the demands of fascist leaders like Hitler and Mussolini, they could avoid a repeat of the devastation of the First World War. Appeasement reached its zenith in 1938, when Britain and France agreed to allow Hitler to annex the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia, with a large ethnic German population. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared that the agreement had brought peace for our time. However, this concession only emboldened Hitler, and within a year, Germany had invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, showing that appeasement had failed to prevent war. The failure of the League of Nations and the rise of nationalism and militarism in the 1930s created a dangerous environment. Nations were increasingly driven by their own national interests, and the belief in diplomacy and collective security eroded. As the world plunged deeper into the shadow of another global conflict, the idealism that had marked the post-World War I era seemed like a distant memory. World War I had not been the war to end all wars. Instead, it was a prelude to an even greater catastrophe, as the unresolved issues and tensions of the post-war period laid the foundation for World War II. As the 1930s unfolded, the world seemed to be teetering on the edge of disaster. The League of Nations was ineffective, nationalism was on the rise, and militaristic regimes were gaining strength across Europe and Asia. While many hoped that the lessons of World War I would prevent another conflict, these aspirations soon proved to be naive. The idealistic notion of the war to end all wars was shattered when World War II erupted in 1939, less than 2 decades after the supposed peace had been secured. The immediate cause of World War II was Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. Hitler's aggressive expansionism, fueled by the belief that the Treaty of Versailles had unjustly punished Germany, was the culmination of years of rising tensions. The Nazi regime's quest for Lebensraum, living space for the German people, was a central element of their foreign policy, and Poland was seen as the next target in this territorial ambition. The invasion of Poland prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany, marking the official start of World War II. However, the roots of the conflict extended far beyond the invasion of Poland. The unresolved issues of World War I, territorial disputes, economic instability, and the rise of totalitarian ideologies, created the conditions for another catastrophic global conflict. The Treaty of Versailles, which had sought to punish Germany, had ultimately failed to bring about lasting peace. Instead, it left Germany embittered and determined to challenge the world order that had been imposed upon it. But Germany was not the only country that sought to challenge the post-World War I settlement. In the years leading up to World War II, Italy, under Mussolini, had invaded Ethiopia in 1935, defying the League of Nations and demonstrating the impotence of the international community. Japan, meanwhile, had already embarked on an aggressive campaign of expansion in Asia, beginning with its invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The failure of the League of Nations to stop these actions highlighted its inability to maintain peace, further undermining the idea that the world could avoid future conflict through diplomacy and collective security. In the face of this growing threat, many countries, including Britain and France, continued to pursue policies of appeasement. In an effort to avoid another war, they made concessions to the fascist powers. The most famous of these was the Munich Agreement in 1938, in which Britain and France allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia, in exchange for a promise of no further territorial expansion. This policy,
championed by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, was intended to avoid war, but it only emboldened Hitler. Rather than being deterred, he saw appeasement as a sign of weakness and pushed further. Less than a year after the Munich Agreement, Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that appeasement had failed. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 was a devastating blow to the idealistic belief that World War I had been the war to end all wars. Far from preventing further conflict, the Treaty of Versailles had created a climate of resentment and instability that contributed to the rise of fascism and the aggressive policies that led to the next World War. The League of Nations, which had been established to prevent such a war, was powerless to stop it. The failure of diplomacy, the rise of totalitarian regimes, and the continued use of military force to settle disputes demonstrated that the world was still trapped in the same cycle of conflict that had existed before World War I. The horrors of World War I had been meant to serve as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of war. Yet despite the suffering and loss, humanity failed to learn the full lesson. In the aftermath of World War I, there had been a moment of optimism, a belief that the horrors of the past could be avoided through diplomacy and international cooperation. But this idealism clashed with the realities of power, nationalism, and the desire for revenge. The hopes for a peaceful post-war world were quickly dashed as nations once again turned to militarism and aggression. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the world was left in ruins. The death toll was staggering, tens of millions of people had perished, and entire countries lay in devastation. The idealism that had surrounded the aftermath of World War I, with hopes for a war to end all wars, had crumbled, and now the global community was left to face the consequences of two world wars within a single generation. The war's devastation, however, spurred a profound shift in international relations. The leaders of the Allied nations, especially the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, recognized that something had to change. There was a shared understanding that the conditions that led to the two world wars, the imbalances of power, the failures of diplomacy, and the rise of aggressive nationalism had to be addressed. The central goal of post-World War II diplomacy was clear: ensure that no such global conflict could ever again break out. At the heart of this new vision was the creation of the United Nations, an international organization designed to replace the League of Nations and provide a stronger framework for preventing future wars. Founded in 1945, the United Nations aimed to foster cooperation between nations, promote human rights, and ensure collective security. Unlike its predecessor, the League of Nations, the United Nations had a much more powerful structure, particularly in the form of the Security Council, where 5 permanent members, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France and China, held veto power. The hope was that these major powers, along with others, could work together to prevent the outbreak of war. Despite the formation of the United Nations, the post-World War II order was shaped by a new set of challenges. The global political landscape had shifted significantly, with the rise of two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations found themselves on opposite sides of a Cold War that would dominate the latter half of the 20th century. While World War II had been a direct confrontation between fascism and the Allied powers, the Cold War was a more ideological and political struggle between communism and democracy. The world did not experience the large-scale direct military confrontations of the two world wars, but the Cold War was still fraught with proxy wars, tensions, and the constant threat of nuclear conflict. The creation of the United Nations did mark a significant departure from the failed diplomacy of the interwar period. The UN was able to mediate some conflicts, send peacekeeping forces to troubled areas, and develop mechanisms for humanitarian aid. However, despite these advancements, the post-war world was still fraught with tension. In the decades following the war, numerous regional conflicts emerged, from the Korean War to the Vietnam War, and the Middle East remained a volatile region marked by intense conflict. While the global structure had changed, the human impulse for power, security, and control persisted. Nevertheless, the creation of international institutions like the United Nations and the Bretton Woods system, which established the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, helped foster a level of cooperation that was unprecedented. These organizations aim to address the root causes of war by promoting economic stability, development and diplomacy. For the first time in history, there was a concerted effort by the world's powers to prevent war on a global scale through cooperation rather than isolation or aggression. Yet the post-World War II period also revealed the deep scars of the past. The legacy of the war to end all wars was not just about avoiding future conflicts, but also about dealing with the political, economic and social trauma left in the wake of two global wars. Many nations struggled to rebuild their economies, cope with the loss of life, and address the social divisions caused by war. In Europe, the destruction of cities, economies, and infrastructure required a massive rebuilding effort. The Marshall Plan, which provided U.S. financial aid to Western Europe, was crucial in stabilizing the continent and preventing the spread of communism. For nations that had been occupied by Axis powers, the post-war period was marked by the difficult task of coming to terms with the horrors of war. Germany, for example, had to reckon with its role in the war and the Holocaust. The Nuremberg trials, which brought Nazi war criminals to justice, were a crucial step in holding individuals accountable for war crimes and atrocities. In Japan, the aftermath of the war also led to significant changes, including the American occupation and the eventual establishment of a democratic government. Despite the enormous challenges, the years following World War II saw the development of a new international order built on the lessons learned from the two world wars. The idea of a war to end all wars had been proven wrong, but the ambition for lasting peace had not disappeared. Instead of idealism, there was now a pragmatic recognition that global peace required collaboration, compromise, and vigilance. By the time the Cold War had ended in the early 1990s, the world had undergone significant changes. The two major superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, had spent nearly half a century locked in a tense ideological and political battle that threatened global peace. The era was marked by the constant fear of nuclear war, yet it also led to a new understanding of global security. Although the Cold War didn't result in another world war, it was not without its own form of violence, as proxy wars raged across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In the aftermath of World War II, the world had entered a new era of international relations, where the threat of global war had shifted. While World War I and World War II had shown the catastrophic consequences of unchecked nationalism, militarism, and imperialism, the Cold War forced the world to reckon with these dynamics in a much different context. Instead of large-scale wars between superpowers, the world saw numerous smaller conflicts fueled by the ideological divide between communism and democracy. The Cold War might not have erupted into the global warfare that was feared in the aftermath of the previous two world wars, but it demonstrated that the pursuit of peace was as fraught with complexity as ever. The end of World War II had also set in motion the end of European colonial empires. The colonial powers of Britain, France and others were weakened by the war, and their control over vast empires began to unravel. The decolonization movements that gained momentum in the 1940s and 1950s were the consequence of both the changing global political environment and the pressure exerted by nationalist movements in colonized territories. This shift drastically reshaped the world's power structure as former colonies gained independence and became new players in international relations. These newly independent nations, often shaped by the lingering shadows of imperialism, contributed to the changing dynamics of peace and security. In the Cold War context, the United States and the Soviet Union had competing visions for how the world should be organized, each seeking to expand its influence. The US pushed for the spread of democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union sought to spread communism. These competing ideologies created the conditions for proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam and Afghanistan, as both superpowers tried to gain an upper hand without triggering direct confrontation. The nuclear arms race, a significant aspect of the Cold War, also brought with it the constant threat of mutually assured destruction. The idea that nuclear weapons could bring an end to civilization in an instant shifted the balance of power in international diplomacy. By the late 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the Cold War and was seen as a victory for the West. However, the end of one era of tension led to the emergence of new challenges. The global political and economic landscape had drastically changed, with the rise of the United States as the sole superpower and the spread of liberal democratic values. But while the Cold War had not resulted in a direct global conflict, it had created new forms of instability. The collapse of the Soviet Union left behind a fragile post-Soviet space, with unresolved territorial disputes and lingering ethnic tensions, particularly in areas like the Balkans, where war had erupted in the 1990s. The modern world has yet to fulfill the hope that World War I was truly the war to end all wars. While the threat of nuclear conflict has waned with arms control treaties and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, modern warfare has evolved. In the post-Cold War era, we have seen an increase in regional conflicts, terrorism, cyber warfare, and proxy wars, such as those in Syria, Ukraine, and Afghanistan. The nature of warfare has become more complex, and the role of international organizations like the United Nations, NATO, and regional alliances has become even more critical in managing these threats. The pursuit of peace, however, remains a central aim in global politics. Today, international institutions and agreements such as the United Nations, NATO, the World Trade Organization, and the International Criminal Court continue to play a role in promoting diplomacy, conflict resolution, and human rights. Yet, the world continues to grapple with the very issues that led to the catastrophic wars of the 20th century: nationalism, militarism, and the pursuit of power. In many ways, the world remains divided along the lines established by both World War I and World War II. The ideal of a war to end all wars remains a poignant reminder that peace requires constant vigilance. Nationalism continues to play a significant role in global politics, with movements for independence, autonomy, and nationalism re-emerging in various parts of the world. Militarism and the desire for military dominance still shape national security policies, and the legacy of empire continues to influence the geopolitics of many regions. While there is no certainty that we will ever achieve the kind of lasting peace envisioned after World War I, the lessons learned from both world wars continue to shape international relations. The memory of the horrors of war, the millions of lives lost, and the destruction of entire societies provide a powerful incentive for leaders and citizens alike to prevent another global conflict. In the end, the war to end all wars may have been a noble but misguided idea. What followed were more wars, more conflict, and a reminder that the pursuit of peace is a long, difficult journey, one that requires constant effort, cooperation, and the willingness to confront the dangerous forces that threaten stability.